I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite and president of Venable Park Investment Council Incorporated. Welcome back to the show, Danielle.
Happy December, Jim.
The Canadian banks seem to be celebrating right now, their profits up quite a bit. Are you sure that's the right way to go?
The profits are great.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that the risk is always in this highly financialized economy that we live in and have been in for the past few years, is that what looks like great profits to these financial conglomerates has a tendency to come back and bite us later and end up being, cost to in terms of bad debt to households, and then ultimately sometimes in terms of bailouts needed by taxpayers. So you get a little skeptical when you see a whole bunch of really lax lending or securitization of bad debts and various things, packaging up different securities, underwriting questionable valued products and selling them to the public, because their capital structure requires them to relatively, I know you can argue that Canada's banks are more highly capitalized than many in the world, but relative to how much money they're actually putting out and how much cash they actually keep in the coffers, it's still a highly levered enterprise. So when you have a lot of risk on risk that is backstopped by assumptions of taxpayer bailouts of too big to fail institutions and that sort of thing, you really start to question, at least you should, in a healthy way, what amount of these profits are just kind of a mirage, and what amount of them are actually built on a sustainable business model. And I think one of the things that disturbs me about the bank earnings that you're seeing is, first of all, that they've been lowering their loan loss provisions again as a way of bringing money back in and calling it profits, which is, I think, totally counter-cyclical to where we should be right now when you've got things like the financial regulators in Canada warning that the banks are heinously exposed to a very bubbly-looking real estate market, and that if we had a downturn in the economy, you could see a major hit to Canadian banks, to balance sheets, to their operations, to their liquidity. So again, you start to worry when they're doing these, bringing things back onto back out of their reserves to boost profits in the short run, and yet at the same time, the overall financial health of the country seems to be degrading. We've got the concern about the new Trump administration and its anti-trade policies and how that might be particularly hard on Mexico and Canada. You've got Canada in the midst of this ongoing decline in the price of oil, notwithstanding the OPEC deal yesterday and the bounce that happened. The fundamentals for supply and demand, the inventory stock, and the huge capacity of the United States to pump its own product today has really altered some of the assumptions that Canadians have always had about, captive customer for our products. So I think we're in the middle of a very tenuous shift in our economic stability here. We've depended way too much on the consumer credit cycle in the past 5 years, and putting money into non-productive assets, borrowing to fix up houses and make houses bigger. But now we're at this point where, and the government is struggling, how do we forge this new energy revolution future that the world is very excited about when we've got all this sunk capital into the antiquated technology? And, you see them doing things like approving these new pipelines. That's really not the infrastructure that we're talking about when we say that there's a huge need for infrastructure investment to propel the world into the next growth boom. Bringing hydrocarbons along in pipes is really old school thinking. What we need is smart grid, wind farms, solar farms, all these big things that other countries are undertaking. So I think Canada's in the middle of this big transition. I think longer term I'm excited about prospects for all sorts of reasons, but in the meantime, I think there's downside, there's risk in the banking system, and so profits, again, I'm a little bit suspicious about how lasting that supposed gain's going to be.
Well, I've noticed the Bank of England put the Royal Bank of Scotland through a stress test, and the Royal Bank of Scotland failed.
Well, the Royal Bank of Scotland is you talk about a storefront with it's like a set on a movie set. You know, it's been gutted. These institutions in the credit bust of 2008 were gutted of all real capital and bought on life support by governments. And the Royal Bank of Scotland is just another example of a franchise that ought to have gone bankrupt in 2008, was brought along, as I say, on this government life support. And what it did, because it was badly managed, because its business models were flawed, this whole securitizing debt and selling junk and calling it AAA that brought down the American banks, the European banks, you know, all these companies were doing the same thing. They ought to have been put out of business in 2008, but because they were extended, they just went back to doing the same destructive things. And so, not surprisingly, they are not going to pass stress tests. They would still take down, you know, they'd still be too big to fail. They'd still pose a global threat because they're undercapitalized and over-risked, and they've got a bunch of crazy people throwing risk against the wall and hoping to extract profits out quick before the thing goes down. That's really the business model of all these institutions.
You have concerns about how pensions have been treated. Can you explain that?
Oh, well, actually, the story that I was applauding today on my blog was that the SEC passed a ruling that said that exchanges, so stock exchanges, so they've been selling order flow. So I've been complaining about this for quite a long time. So, this sense of duty, of fairness and transparency that has always been part of the utility of financial markets, or at least the exchanges that were utilities in the old days, where, you know, no customer was supposed to be given an unfair advantage over another, that everyone was approaching it with the same information, you know, this idea that everyone's got the same information. Of course, many times people are trading on insider information, but that's something different. In its inception and setup, an exchange is supposed to be completely open and even to all participants, moving on public information. But what's happened in the past few years is that they became for-profit institutions, and they quickly figured out that if they gave preferential treatment, advance notice, advance signal to certain members of the trading community, they would be richly compensated for that. By the same token, the funds and management companies of the world, you know, the Fidelities and the Charles Schwab and all these companies that had sold themselves to the investing public as, you know, independents looking out for the best interests of the customers, you know, that they would give them, you know, cheap trading, and it was all about providing service at low cost. Well, what they actually did to line their own pockets was they were saying that on the one hand, but on the other hand, they've been selling their customers' order flow to these HFT firms. So there's been a lot of people complicit in this fraud, really, that's been going on. So the large funds have been selling their order flow to HFT companies, who then get preferential advanced trading capacity, whether it's co-location, like putting their office close to the exchange, or whether it's just signals that are allowed to go faster and faster. And the nub of it is that they then abuse regular investors, many of whom are pension flows, for example, who are not day trading. They're just trying to buy good quality investments and pick up dividends and, you know, have liquidity when they need it to sell some things and that sort of thing. So this whole industry has really conspired against that slow-moving, you know, they look at it as the dumb capital. Meanwhile, I look at it as the legitimate capital that's supposed to be doing productive things and moving, you know, capital from savers to investing in the economy, has been really undermined by this predatory behavior. And it's all a nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And if you look at the HFT firms, they've been incredibly enriched, not because they're brilliant and smart or excellent at their analysis or gifted in the financial business, but because they've built this algorithm that allows them to pay off people for flow and abuse it and scalp profits. What we call front running is really what we've always called that, and it's always been a felony, and it's always been, securities fraud. But they've got away with it for many years, and it's been insanely lucrative for the exchanges, who are selling the public trust and using and abusing it to make profits for these corporations. And it's been also by the people who are supposed to be fiduciaries, managing other people's money, have been selling it for this quick profit for themselves. So at the end of the day, it's the legitimate users of these markets that are having to give away chunks of their capital, whether they know it or not. It's what's happening. It's all hidden. It's very destructive in the long run to faith and stability of the markets. And as they would argue, well, it provides liquidity, but that's all nonsense, because we've seen many times that every time there's any kind of a shock event, liquidity vanishes. And in fact, there's many companies who track the mini crashes and flash crashes on a daily, weekly basis in major indices and markets in the world, because you've got so much of this crazy behavior going on in nanoseconds. So, so back to the point is that, I've been long thinking, surely someone's going to sue them for this. Surely, there's many lawyers out there that work on contingency fees who are just dying to sue the exchanges for this abuse of trust, which is costing legitimate investors money. And of course, in the initial effort at that, the position of the exchanges was that they had indemnity, that they weren't subject to prosecution, which seemed really bizarre. But it turns out that the SEC has now ruled that that indemnity doesn't apply to when you're selling, preferential treatment to HFT front runners. That indemnity was about something else, acting as regulators of your members. It isn't anything to do with this particular issue. So that was awesome, because now, as I say, the lawyers are going to go after these predators like rabid dogs, and they so deserve to have, big chunks of their profit clawed back, because that was other people's money that they have illicitly taken. And so once you get accountability back and saying, no, sorry, we're not going to let you keep running this racketeering operation and calling it legitimate, we're going to actually start inflicting big settlements against you for the damages you're causing, then I think you get some more sober assessment on the part of the exchanges, who need to stop selling this flow and go back to being trustworthy utilities that are there to provide the infrastructure on which the world transactions take place.
We'll have more with Danielle Park right after the break.
GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International Spotlight is on an 1109 carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Danielle Park. Danielle, the Canadian Natural Resources Minister has just said the federal government is willing to use force to make sure the pipelines can get punched through from Edmonton to Vancouver. Is that sending a jackboots in the sand message to Canadians who oppose having their environment messed up?
This is a very contentious issue right now in the world. You've seen this in the Standing Rock standoff in Dakota, where, the indigenous people and other groups who oppose this type of old, as I say, this is dinosaur energy policy to, keep extracting this stuff out of the ground and then pumping it across the world and tankering it around and putting huge environmental risk and impact on everything. And when we've got all these other alternative fuels readily available now and just dying for investment to bring them on stream, it makes zero sense to keep following these very destructive policies. And I know, again, sunk costs, and lots of people are trained in this sector, and they've got all their life investment of education and experience in, in the oil sector, as an example, or gas. But that doesn't mean that they can hold back the natural and necessary evolution of the world today. And you've got a lot of people who that penny dropped a while ago, right? We see that there's all these exciting new ways to get energy that's extremely more efficient and far less damaging, and much more friendly to water supplies and air quality, everything. So those people are now saying, wait a minute, you crazies keep wanting to do these destructive things, and we're going to have to stand up to you. So you've got these standoffs now becoming pretty common, and I found it quite ironic or fascinating that, I don't know if you caught it, but in the standoff in Dakota, some 2,000 ex-military veterans are coming out to do a human wall, basically in support of the protesters, because the police have been militarized and, sending in tear gas and pelting them with rubber bullets and causing some actual quite a bit of harm and suffering on these protesters who were there in peaceful resistance. And these are the veterans, if you think about that, Jim, who were overseas in the Middle East fighting for America's interest in oil. And they are now back with all the scars and cost personally of what that endeavor meant. And they are now standing in peaceful protest against the expansion of pipelines in North America. So I think we're going to see more of that in the instance in Canada that you referenced there, because, as I say, it's different than, this is not just tree huggers, from the 60s trying to stop progress. It's the very opposite of that. This is people who understand that progress goes in a completely different direction, and that investing money that's hard to come by, it's hard to get tax dollars, they're shrinking, there's less funds to go around, to, infrastructure spending is this buzzword that everybody agrees with. Awesome. But what infrastructure? If we're going to put more money after bad, throw more money down mine shafts of products that are not in the best interest of the world, when we have other stuff so readily available, I think that's where you get this complete divide between old school and new school. And again, as I say, the new school is not anti-progress. The new school is saying, gosh, this is so smart, so obvious, so more efficient, so great productivity. There's so much benefit to these new approaches that why in the world would we waste more good money after bad on these old things?
I wonder about Alberta. Why aren't they a world leader in plastics? If 3D printing is about to take over large manufacturing and have it done locally, they're going to need plastics. Why isn't Alberta, with all their petroleum resources, not a world leader in plastic development?
Well, there you go. Because I'll tell you why. Because for many years, and during the commodities boom, starting in 2001 into about 11, people thought that would be insatiable, that China would never stop needing product, that we'd have a constant customer, and that you could just, drill baby drill and pump baby pump, and no one would ever question the business model. But, here we are in 2017, going into 2017, the world is fundamentally different today than it was in 2001 or even in 2008. The technological revolution that's just compound, like, Moore's Law, every 18 months things get faster and more efficient, double in their capacity. That's the kind of world we're in right now. India just installed the largest solar array in the world, and that's just a story that was out yesterday. I mean, this is something that's not going away. It's not going back in the box, because it makes perfect sense on every level, and it's a time that we need desperately in a world that has malinvested and really spent a long time on financial antics that have been very destructive in the end. We have now got this opportunity, as Bill Nye says, to become the next great generation, right? We are at a huge point of evolution here where we can make a whole bunch smarter choices going forward. And so I think that's why you're going to have this standoff. I mean, you've got it right now in the incoming Trump government, who says, nonsense about, climate issues are farce and not true. And then you've got the whole world standing saying, are you crazy? Like, obviously you're a fool if you're going to say that. And P.S., doesn't America need economic growth and development today as well? And if they do, why would a so-called business genius, that Trump calls himself a business genius, why would a business genius want to shut down something that's the biggest growth boom in the world today? And that being the alternative energy efficiency, all that stuff. So I think they'll lose because what they're saying makes no sense. They'll lose the fight, as it were, to hold back progress because it's got so much momentum. But I do think we're in a dangerous time here because you're going to have this constant standoff between the old and the new technology believers, between the old economy and the new economy. And ultimately, the new economy has to win. That's how we'll progress.
Well, I'm glad to see that they're putting turbine power into the Bay of Fundy, and one of the most ignored resources in British Columbia are massive tides because of Vancouver Island. The tides are different up the entire coast, and you have Seymour Narrows where they had to blast a giant rock out after the Second World War because the whirlpools are so big they could suck down a ship, but the tide that goes through there still zips through it, 15, 20 knots. Why not use that?
Absolutely, and they need to use that. They need to use all of that. There's enough solar power hitting the world every day to power every single thing that the world does. But we don't need to only use solar power. That just gives you an example of the capacity here. We obviously can use all sorts of different solutions for different areas and what's the least intrusive and the most efficient. And it requires a lot of investment, both from the public sector and the private sector. But the payoff is huge in pretty much every way you could measure it, in terms of new jobs, in terms of better quality of life, in terms of lower operating costs for families and businesses. So I think it's all really exciting. But again, I was thinking back to an example of, how we used to have smoking in every building and bus. And, when you and I were growing up, it was a common thing. You'd go to the movies, it was blue with smoke. You go to restaurants, blue with smoke. Buses, airplanes, if you remember, everywhere. And then some guy in the UK said one day, I think it was only in about 2001, hey, this isn't good because it's very bad for everyone's health. It costs a lot to have this constant damage and pollution in the environment, and everyone's getting sick from working in it. It's damaging the interior of buildings and property. It's just not good. Let's stop it. Let's say you can't smoke inside, right? This is the analogy that I have right now with the environmental stuff. And everyone's like, well, that's ridiculous. That's prejudicial. That's a pipe dream. That's never going to happen. No one will ever agree to that. And yet you just chip away at it, and then one day the rules are changed. People stop smoking inside, and then a few years later everyone says, oh my God, can you imagine that we used to actually have smoking inside, right? So I think that's the way the world works, and it can happen very quickly. There'll be a lot of resistance, a lot of denial, and then the change and the improvement is so obvious that everyone just eventually flips, and it's as if you look back on a time and say, how could we have been that foolish? How could we have been so dumb? How could we have been so wasteful? And I think that's where we're going. 5 years from now, I think we'll look back on this time and say, wow, what were we thinking? For so long, we did such dumb things.
Well, I can see in 50 years, too, people saying, we burned petroleum. It's such a valuable resource for pharmaceuticals, plastics. Everything in your house is made out of it. Why did we burn it when it's so useful doing other things?
Absolutely, and less destructive things, right?
Danielle, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Hey, thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.